Thank you, Riverbend. Thank you for your grace. I realize when you hear an announcement like that, there's a lot of different ways to process it, but thank you for your understanding, for your creativity, and most of all, for your grace. And thank you for being here this morning. I realize that's no small thing. There are a lot of other places you can be, but thank you that you took the time to be here in this physical place together this Sunday morning, or any Sunday morning, because it's no small thing. It's been 20 years since I've had to go to church with my family, but I can tell you for the decades that I would come to church on a Sunday with my family, it was some of the most challenging times in my life. I don't know if you experience getting ready and going to church on a Sunday morning like I did, but my wife and I had some of the most ridiculous arguments in our entire marriage on Sunday mornings, driving to church. I used to think it was some kind of spiritual warfare. It's some passive-aggressive struggle to say, do we really want to be going to this place? And I recognize that it's a choice that you have, and it's a sacrifice that you make. And thank you for that. It was a number of years ago, a good friend of mine asked me to help him with a project that he was working on. And he told me about the project, and I was glad to help, but I knew that it was going to involve a lot of hours and a lot of many weeks of work. And I enjoyed the idea of working with my friend, but he didn't have a lot of margins, but I thought it was worth it. It was worth it to spend the time to help him with this project. I was particularly suited to help, and I was flattered that he asked me. And from the very beginning of our project, working on that project together, I made it very clear to him that I didn't want any reward. I didn't want any compensation. I didn't want my name attached to the project, not because I was ashamed of it, not because I wasn't proud of what we were doing. I just felt like that's what I wanted to do for my friend. I wanted to be a part of it, but I really didn't want any sort of compensation or remuneration for that project. And we completed that project, and it went really well, and it was very well received, and he was compensated for that project. And throughout that time, he kept saying, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" I kept saying, "Yes, yes, yes, this is something that I wanted to do." It was a sacrifice that I wanted to make. Now, before you think that's particularly heroic or generous, it's something we all do all the time. Perhaps we are unaware of the intentional sacrifices that we make every day. It's kind of like what I consider a spiritual form of time travel. We are making a bargain with the future. We are sacrificing something today because we believe that something in the future will be improved or something will be better. We do it all the time. You do it when you exercise. When you get up and you sweat and you work out, you do that because you believe in this bargain with the future, in this traveling through time, that there will be a day in the future when you will be healthier and your life will be longer because you sacrifice this time to exercise. We do it when we diet. When we eat ridiculous things like kale and quinoa because we believe that somehow our bodies will be healthier in the future. We make sacrifices for our children because we're investing in their future. We're making a bargain with the future. We make sacrifices in education and in training and in our careers. We do these things all the time. And what it really is an act of faith. It is an act of faith to reach into the future and say, I will make a sacrifice today for the benefit of a better day in the future. Last week, we began a study of faith. We began a study about the nature and the details, the idiosyncrasies of what it means to live a life of faith. And this study is going to take our entire fall. It's 12 weeks. And we included in this study, what Audrey mentioned, a Wednesday night component. We invited all of you to come on Wednesday night to bring your families, to have a meal together, to have a time of discussion with your peers, with other people about this life of faith. And Wednesday night was wonderful. We had almost 250 people here, and our kids had a great time, our students had a great time, our young adults had a great time. More people joined our choir on Wednesday nights, and there were hundreds of people involved in conversations about their faith. They sacrificed their middle of the week to come together to do that. And what we're studying is one single chapter, the 11th chapter of the book that is called Hebrews in the New Testament. And the book of Hebrews in the 11th chapter begins with a definition of faith. It basically says that faith is a confidence in what we hope for, the assurance about what we do not yet see. It is a concise definition of what faith is, and then the rest of the chapter is an illustration of the attributes of genuine, intentional faith. And it introduces us to characters throughout the history of the people of God who manifested in their lives stories that teach us about the character of faith. And the very first story is the story of two brothers, Cain and Abel. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, the first story, the first illustration of what an intentional faith looks like, tells us that by faith, Cain brought God a better offering, a better sacrifice, or Abel brought God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offering, and by faith, Abel still speaks to us today, even though he is dead. What it is portraying for us is the value of a sacrificial faith. I want to talk about what that looks like, and specifically today, I want us to spend a few moments considering why it is so hard to live an intentional, sacrificial life of faith. But before we talk about that, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your word spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to encourage us and to challenge us to be intentional and sacrificial in our life of faith. I pray that for myself and for my family, for I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Faith is easy. The life of faith is easy. But if we're casual about it, the things that we believe are manifested in the ways that we behave. If you want to know what someone really believes, look at their life, look at their behavior. They may say they believe one thing, but if they behave in a different way, they don't really believe that. But if we want to be intentional, if we want the things that we believe to challenge us and to form our faith, it gets hard. Why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult to live a life of intentional faith, to aspire to be better, to live more consistently, to live with greater integrity? Some people say, well, maybe it's because of doubt. Doubt creeps in and undermines our faith. But doubt is really symptomatic. I think sometimes this more has to do with fear. We're afraid. We're afraid of what living a life of faith might cost us. It might cost us some relationships, some friendships, some opportunities. It might cost us some fun. Perhaps one of the reasons that we struggle to live an intentional life of faith is not just doubt or fear. It's because we're prideful. We're proud. We don't think we're fine the way we are. We don't need to grow. We don't need to change. Well, today I want to take a look at the story of Cain and Abel, because the author of the book of Hebrews points out to us that they are an example of what intentional faith looks like, that Abel in particular is a life lived sacrificially, and the power of a sacrificial faith. And in this story, I believe it shows us why it's so hard. And I want to share with you three challenges, three obstacles to living a sacrificial or an intentional faith. And the first one is the challenge of comparison. Now, comparison is intrinsically not a bad thing. We use comparison as a metric. We use comparison to kind of measure ourselves. We compare ourselves to our peers. We compare ourselves to our dreams, to our goals, to our ideals. It's by comparison that we fashion a path for our life, that we challenge ourselves. We know we can be better because we compare ourselves to others who we believe, who we observe are more successful or have more favor or are living a better life or accomplishing things that we would like to accomplish. Comparison is not intrinsically bad. Comparison is part of evaluating how we're doing in life. But as with anything, it comes under what I call the law of use and abuse. I believe that there is a law in the universe of use and abuse, that we have been given everything to use, but it becomes a problem when we take what we have been given to use, like food, and we abuse it. Time, and we abuse it. Our bodies, and we abuse them. They are given to us to use, but we abuse it. And this is what happens with comparison. We weaponize comparison. And we start to evaluate ourselves and evaluate others as better than or less than. And we start to marginalize others. We start to use phrases like, well, I'm glad I'm not as bad as that person. And we embarrass ourselves, we humiliate ourselves, we beat ourselves up when we compare ourselves, and we weaponize that comparison, and we believe that we fall short. We see sort of the dark side, the weaponized version of comparison in the story of Cain and Abel. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, it tells us that Abel made an offering to God. Cain and Abel both made offerings. But it says that Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. Now, the problem is, why? Why was Abel's offering better than Cain's? Theologians have wrestled with this for 4,000 or 5,000 years. There are hundreds of different interpretations. But if you go back to the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel, this is what it tells us. In verse 1, it tells us that Adam and Eve came out of the garden. They got kicked out of the garden. And this is the first story of what happened on the outside of paradise. And Cain and Abel are the first two children born outside of the garden. Adam and Eve had sex, and they had a child, and they named him Cain. They also had a second child, and they named him Abel. And it tells us in Genesis, it says, now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. So what was it that Abel did that was better than Cain? And theologians have scratched their heads and worried themselves sick about this. Some of them say, well, Cain's offering was the leftovers. It was just kind of some of what he had from the harvest or some of the fruit of the field. We have no indication that that's what it was, but they start to say, well, maybe what he brought was just an afterthought. Maybe it was a casual offering, whereas Abel, he brought the first fruits. He brought the fat of his flocks. Other theologians say, well, maybe it's because to make his offering, Abel had to shed blood. He actually had to sacrifice an animal. And after 4,000 years of theologians debating why this is, why Cain's offering was not as successful or as favored as Abel's, you know what the conclusion is? It's a theological shoulder shrug. It's like, well, we don't know. I was raised, and perhaps you were raised this way too. I was raised to believe that my responsibility was to do my best. That's all my parents ever asked. They just said, Dave, just do your best. And as long as you do your best, things will work out. It will go well for you. But as I grew up, I realized that wasn't true. I was doing my best, and there were other people that were mailing it in, and they were sailing through life. And I said, I'm over here beating my head against the wall. I'm rubbing my fingers to the bone. I am doing my best, and I'm not nearly as successful as these other people who don't even seem to be trying. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever experienced what feels like an injustice and an unfairness in life? It is what leads us to weaponize comparison. It's what leads us to start to marginalize some other person. It's what leads us to think that that person doesn't deserve to succeed. I deserve to succeed. I'm working way harder than they are. And this is when we start to weaponize comparison. It's when I look at the success of another person and I say, they haven't worked as hard as me. They don't deserve it as much as I do. You ever do that? You ever find yourself comparing yourself to someone else thinking, well, how come they have all the wins and they have all the success and they have all the luck and I'm still over here struggling? It's why it's difficult for us to live a life of sacrificial faith. Because a sacrificial faith says, all I have to do is my best. I give you my offering. I give you the best that I've got. And you do what you will with it. It's up to you, God. I trust you with the outcome. I will do my best, and I will trust you with the rest. But that's hard to do. That's hard to do because of the weight of comparison, because we weaponize comparison and we measure ourselves against others who we think don't deserve the success that they have or the favor that they have. The second obstacle is the obstacle of entitlement. The obstacle of entitlement is undergirded by three words. And I've often told you that I believe these are the three most dangerous words in the English language. And they are these: I deserve better. It is a reflection of our sense of entitlement, our sense of I am not being treated fairly, that I deserve better than I have. And that sense of entitlement is in the story of Cain and Abel. It tells us in Hebrews chapter 11 that God commended and counted Abel as righteous when he spoke well of his offerings. Now, it doesn't say that Cain did anything bad. It doesn't say that Cain was wrong. It just says that God showed favor to Abel. But if you look at the story in Genesis chapter 4 of how Cain reacted to this, it says, the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. He didn't show him the same kind of affirmation. Oh, so Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? You know why it is? It's called victimology. We see ourselves as a victim of injustice or unfairness. We evaluate, because of our expectations and because of our sense of entitlement, how we think life ought to go. And when it doesn't go the way that we think it should go, or we believe that we are entitled to experience, we see ourselves as victims of injustice or victims of unfairness. And what typically happens is that breeds in us a sense of resentment, a sense of anger, a sense of frustration, a sense of jealousy, and a sense of envy. Exactly what happened to Cain. because he had this sense that my offering should receive the same amount of praise as my brother's. And when it didn't, he saw himself as the victim because he didn't receive what he was entitled to. I didn't receive what I deserved because I deserve better. Let me tell you what a sacrificial faith does, how a sacrificial faith copes with this sense of injustice. It uses the same phrase, it uses the same words. I don't get what I deserve, but it turns it upside down. If I'm a victim, I say those in a pejorative sense. I don't get what I deserve because I deserve better. But if I have a sacrificial and intentional faith, I say, I don't get what I deserve. Thank God I don't get what I deserve. Because what I deserve is to be exposed. What I deserve is to be exactly what I've earned. What I don't deserve is the grace that I experience because I don't get what I deserve. Understand the difference? Sacrificial faith doesn't see itself as a victim. It doesn't live under the weight of its expectations or a sense of entitlement. It doesn't weaponize comparison and look down on others or tear itself down. But it's hard. It's hard to do because comparison and entitlement are legitimate weights. But there's a third thing. There's a third thing, and it's the idea of self-centeredness. Selfishness, egotism, narcissism. You ever met a pathological narcissist? You ever met anybody who's really so self-absorbed and so self-centered that they can't really interact with others in a healthy way? Some of you are going, yeah, I married the guy. But have you ever met, I can tell you this, that the pathology of narcissism is not rooted in confidence. It is not rooted in self-assurance. If you scratch the surface of a narcissist, you will find raging insecurity. Because that self-confidence, that self-assurance, that arrogance that comes out is really coming from a place of great insecurity. And so it's a projection of a part of them trying to cope with the fear that they aren't good enough, with their need for perfection, with that unattainable standard. This is what was going on in the story of Cain and Abel. In Genesis chapter 4, it talks about what happened with Cain. God says to Cain, he says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. That tendency to think only of ourselves. And the reality is we have to. We have to take care of ourselves. It is not possible for you to love others unless you love yourself. How does the phrase go? Love others as you love yourself. If you're not healthy, if you're not taking care of yourself, you cannot possibly take care of anyone else. So there is a need for us to care for ourselves. There is a need for us to be strong and to be confident. There are situations that all of us are placed in where we are the go-to person. Where in that moment, everything is on us. And there are times when we have to step up. And that's different. That's different than the self-centeredness that says everything is about me. But what God tells Cain is the temptation for that is right at the door. It's right there. No one is immune to it. No one is so humble that they are not struggling to find that place where they can sacrifice and serve others without self-sacrificing, without demeaning themselves, without saying, oh, the reason that I help you is because I'm no good at all. Are any of you married to a saint? Any of you have that burden? Yeah, I am. I am married to a saint. If you don't know my wife Diane, you have never met Saint Diane. It is annoying to be married to a person who is as godly and committed to their faith as my wife is, because she just dominates me. She should be the pastor of this church. There's no way I should be doing this, because she's just amazing. And this week we were talking about this problem, and kind of like talking to my wife about being married to a narcissist. She's like, "Oh, I get it." But the reality is, she immediately said, "Oh, I got something I want you to read." And it was one of a half a dozen books that she's reading about discipleship and about the spiritual life. It's a book by Calvin Miller called Into the Depths of God. And basically, she said, "Read this," and I want to share with you what she pointed out from Calvin Miller. It says, "Most of our narcissism isn't blatant. In fact, most of us work hard to keep from looking self-centered. We know how to duck our heads and try to look sheepish and yielding, if only for the sake of keeping our spiritual reputation. But we are somewhat false. Remember this. Narcissus was beautiful. The gods all agreed, but he drowned himself trying to embrace his own reflection." You see, the problem is that we become arrogant, we become self-centered when we separate ourselves from others, when we think that we are better than others, or more necessary than others, or more important than others. And this arrogance creates a jealousy and an envy and a rebellion that wells up in us. And the evidence of this is often blame shifting, because we don't take responsibility for the weight of our own choices. And so in that idea of being a victim, we shift blame, and we say it's because of these circumstances, or because of these other people, or because I didn't have the opportunity. And what that eventually boils into is envy and jealousy. And it eventually boils into a hostility. And this is what happened in the story of Cain and Abel. In Genesis chapter 4, it tells us that Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out into the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. As I look around at the culture that we live in, I see a culture of Cain. I see a culture of victimhood, and I see a culture of blame shifting, and I see a culture of comparison, better than or worse than. And the need in our day is for people who are sacrificial in their faith. People who understand that my responsibility is to live intentionally and sacrificially, preparing for a better future by making sacrifices today. And there's a couple ways that we do that. The first way that we do that is we own our stuff. And we say, I'm going to do my best. I will give my best, regardless of the outcome. I will do my very best, and I will not cut the corners, because the future deserves it, because that is the sacrifice I will make. Regardless of whether you appreciate it or acknowledge it, or whether it makes a difference in your life, you're going to get the best of me. You're going to get the best from me. But it also means a second thing. It also means looking at the success of others and the struggle of others, and not devaluing them, and not looking down on them, but saying, I see the best in you. I understand the best in you. This is what a sacrificial faith looks like in a culture of victims. in a culture of self-centeredness. This is what it looks like when we weaponize comparison, and when we find out that we're operating from a sense of entitlement, and that our self-centeredness is getting the best of us. This is what we see in the story of Cain and Abel. We see the story of an intentional sacrifice. Hebrews 11:4 tells us that by faith, it was by faith that Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. The outcome of Abel's life was that we are here today, perhaps 4,000 years later, still learning from him. How do we know that the sacrifices we make will not have the same kind of effect? But it's hard. It's hard to do. It's hard to live that sacrificial faith because of the struggle of comparison and the struggle of entitlement and the struggle of self-centeredness. But Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4 tells us, or Genesis chapter 4 tells us the story, and Hebrews 11:4 summarizes it for us. It says, by faith, Abel made an offering, and God considered that offering better than the offering that Cain made. And by faith, he was commended as righteous by God when God spoke well of Abel's offering. And by faith, and now by faith, Abel still speaks to us, even though he is dead. This is what an intentional faith looks like. This is not a casual or an accidental faith. This is a sacrificial faith. It is the first attribute of what the author of Hebrews describes for us in the very first verse. It says, faith is the confidence of what we hope for, the assurance of what we do not yet see. My friend, when I helped him out with this project, the project was really successful, and I'm very proud of what we put together, of what we did. And a few months after we finished the project, he told me what he got paid for it. And I kind of rethought my offer to, 10% would have been, but no, that wasn't why I did it. I did it because he's my friend. I did it believing that this was the right thing to do, and I did my best. And to this day, I have no regrets about that. Because this is what faith does. Faith is intentional, and it is sacrificial. And that's no small thing. So thank you for those of you who came out on Wednesday. It's no small thing to set aside those hours in the middle of your week. No one has margins anymore. It's no small thing that you would invest in the people in a small group and open your life up. That's no small thing. In fact, it's no small thing that you were here today. You took the time to get out and you fought through the ridiculous arguments over whether or not your wife is wearing too much perfume or whether you did a lousy job shaving this morning as you're driving in, whatever the ridiculous argument is. Thank you for struggling through that and making the sacrifice to be here. Thank you, Riverbend.